The era following the Second World War would be remembered as consensus. After everyone had been through so much loss and suffering, people were largely willing to just accept the status quo that was emerging, nobody wanting to rock the boat. In 1945, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal would be entrenched, even after his death, with the institutionalization of a Keynesian model for fiscal and monetary policy. While in Britain, Clement Attlee's Labour government would be elected, and the United Kingdom would make the leap to a welfare state. This new social liberal framework was based much more on a positive liberty notion. In Britain, the National Health Service would be developed, and the government would set out a policy of achieving full employment. The war had very badly damaged Britain, and so, as so many returned, it was reasoned that if the country could not return to prosperity, it could at least maintain a level of comfort for Britons, an unofficial idea being that we had earned it as a gift to ourselves from the war. Yet in the United States, the economy would shift to a peacetime one relatively quickly, and America would enter into a boom time. And so, on the part of Americans, a quite common perspective was a sense of support for the figures and institutions who had gotten them through the war. In 1947, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Ludwig von Mises would form the Mount Pelerin Society. This would act as a sort of intellectual crucible for neoliberalism. Seeing this very statist shift that was emerging across the West, they would set out to reinvent classical liberalism. Believing that economic planning on the part of the state would lead inevitably to totalitarianism, they wanted to propose a free market alternative. And so the world would go forward into the post-war era. The territorial empires of Europe would recede, with perhaps quite symbolically, Britain and France demonstrating that they could no longer maintain influence nor control over the Suez, with the United States asserting itself as the clear geopolitical hegemon. Backed by the development aid of the Marshall Plan, the European economies would slowly limp back, though they would never really regain momentum. All the while, the United States surged ahead. It would enter a time of consumerism, of optimism and excitement, and particularly in the latter 1950s, the growth of teenage culture, as now even the youth of America were gaining disposable income. All the while, the split between Marxists that had been emerging over the past decade would continue to expand, with the Frankfurt School that had now found a home in the United States. Back in 1947, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer would publish Dialectic of Enlightenment. They would introduce the concept of culture industry, arguing that mass entertainment is not an organic expression, but a top-down factory, producing standardized cultural goods, pacifying the workers' superficial desires. This school of thought would continue to grow, and while the liberal progressive lineage remained dominant, this more Marxist cousin was really developing. They would really begin to shift from the material considerations of Marxism to something that was much more concerned with cultural phenomena. They would argue that capitalism reproduces itself via ideological recruitment that begins at childhood. The 1960s would see a rapid expansion of such ideas. At the same time, back in Europe, particularly in France, the dominant philosophical movement of structuralism, the belief that human culture can be understood through universal and objective systems, was beginning to be abandoned in favor of poststructuralism, attempting to dismantle notions of truth. They would begin to enter into American literary and humanities departments. Initially, this sphere would be focused on literature primarily, dismantling truth in literature, authorship, and text. Yet this new approach to epistemology lended itself quite well to critical theory. In 1966, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and Roland Barthes would deliver a lecture at Johns Hopkins University. There, Derrida would introduce deconstruction, arguing that language is inherently unstable, and that binary oppositions, such as speech and writing, nature and culture, rational and irrational, always prioritize one term over the other, and in turn maintain hierarchical power. You know, like short and tall, which is why everyone thinks short is better, or old and young, which is why everyone wants to be old. What the Marxists of the Frankfurt School had been attempting to do in the realm of sociology, economic, and cultural systems this newly injected French movement was attempting to do with language. By the 1960s, these schools of thought would begin to intermingle, beginning to birth some new form of leftist thought, one that was rapidly leaving behind the materialism and focus on the working class that Marxism had always held, and instead focusing on deconstructing the phenomena of society. The 1960s would birth the New Left. Critical theory would rapidly rise in American and British universities, critiquing capitalism and bourgeois liberalism. One very definitional text to this movement at this time was Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. It would lay out many of the fundamentals of what this movement was attempting to do. They were certainly within the Marxist lineage, though now they were shifting away from working-class economics to cultural, psychological, and bureaucratic oppression and alienation, arguing that the great conflict of history between oppressor and oppressed was actually much deeper than only material, and in fact existed on every level of society. Yet for now, these were freak academics doing their weird nonsense back in the universities. Most of English society was pretty happy, but there was something that felt a little bit off. The post-war era had brought enormous prosperity to the United States. There was an enormous burst of wealth, so much more freedom and excitement than there was before, particularly for the young. Yet to many, this felt cold and hollow. The corporate America that was driving this prosperity seemed artificial, alienating. And so new cultural movements would form, mostly younger people looking for some sort of authenticity, something that felt real. That spiritual vacuum and sensation of inauthenticity and being stifled that existed in the post-war era will lead to new artistic and cultural movements. Many would begin to explore more raw emotional expressions. A great many would take interest in Eastern mysticism, particularly those from Hindu and Buddhist thought, and as well many would begin to latch on to existential philosophy. In 1956, Allen Ginsberg would publish Howl, while Jack Kerouac would publish On the Road. These would be cultural touchstones of what would come to be known as the Beat Generation, reacting to what they referred to as the man in the gray flannel suit, the corporate American archetype of conformity, inauthenticity, and hollowness. They would argue that the standardized, hyper-rationalized consumer capitalism of the United States was an industrial monster, one that they would often refer to as Moloch, a god worshipped by ancient Canaanites, or I don't know, maybe the DNC now, which demanded human sacrifice. For the Beats, they would say that this corporate American monster killed the soul. They would take a great interest in Zen Buddhism, begin exploring jazz improv, spontaneous prose, and spoken poetry. You know, like the guy with a black beret and turtleneck, delivering some real pseudo-intellectual poem over the backdrop of some guy playing a stand-up bass, then everyone snap claps. That. And yet maybe the biggest thing they would introduce is the idea of voluntary poverty and wandering, being unencumbered, and simply exploring free. This would take the form of road trip adventures that would be documented, and particularly as the interstate highway system was constructed, the idea of young people driving across the country, no attachments, no responsibilities, unencumbered and to an extent ascetic, would be extremely enticing to people who were looking for something more than the predictable life of a post-war American. Later on, toward the tail end of this movement, Beat author Neil Cassidy and author Ken Kesey would organize a very high-profile road trip of this nature. This would garner a great deal of attention in California, particularly as they had found out about LSD, and so made a big part of their cross-country adventure, taking and sharing it, decorating their bus and themselves in bright fractaloid patterns, reminiscent of the visual experience of the drug. As well, upon the showing of the tapes of their trip, they would quite often be joined by a house band, playing a very experimental sort of blues, filled with distortion and curious modal jam elements. The authors and their friends on the bus would be known as the Merry Pranksters, while this house band, the Warlocks, later Grateful Dead. In the early 1960s Bay Area, there was a whole new wave of cultural experimentation beginning to form, particularly amongst the young upper classes, taking the ideas of the Beats in a much more spiritual and perhaps libertine direction. At the same time, in the East Coast, academics had become quite curious about this substance. The most notable amongst these academics would be Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who would begin research first on psilocybin and then later on LSD. By 1964, Alpert would be kicked out of Harvard. Timothy Leary would go as well, claiming that he had been kicked out for his cred, though really, he just decided to join his friend. Working out of Timothy Leary's Millbrook home in New York, they would begin an East Coast parallel to what had been emerging in California. At its core, what they were developing was based around the taking of LSD and the psychological spiritual states that accompanied it. They would argue that political revolution is useless without an internal consciousness revolution, and that Western rationality is a mental prison. They would take great inspiration from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, notably the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Advaita Vedanta. Up to this point, these parallel intellectual movements could be said to both be a genuine spiritual response to the cold materialism of the post-war era, but at the same time was also just a bit of upper-class libertinism, coinciding with a sudden surge in swinging that had emerged in both the United States and Britain amongst the middle and upper classes. Either way, take the serious or non-serious elements, and what was clear is that to many, something was lacking at this time, and that the post-war consensus wouldn't be able to go on forever. Shortly before, in 1962, Students for a Democratic Society, led by Tom Hayden, would publish the Port Huron Statement. This would be a part of a political movement that in many ways shared common traits with the Frankfurt School, but was far less in its head an academic, able to reach many more people. They called for participatory democracy, arguing that modern bureaucratic society isolated individuals, asserting that people should have direct control over the decisions that affect their lives. This was a rejection of both the statist communism of the Soviets and with Western liberal capitalism. And so now, the mid-60s were emerging. These ideas from the fringes were beginning to seep into popular culture, particularly driven by musicians. This nexus of new leftism, the second-generation beat movement of Kesey, Cassidy, and the Pranksters, and the East Coast intellectual spiritualism of Leary and Alpert, were all converging on something new. What would emerge over the latter half of the 1960s can be best summarized by Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, and drop out. It's very difficult to describe exactly what this nexus of movements had in common. It was extremely colorful, driven in great part by the taking of psychedelic drugs. It was sexually experimental, very musical, and had a strong focus on freedom, often engaging in communitarian projects, and a fascination with road trips. But at its core, it was rejecting the stifling culture of post-war America and trying to find something that felt more real, something that felt spiritual, and not just material. Now, the actual numbers of people who truly involved themselves with this movement was quite small. Most of the young people at the time would just walk past them and think that they're weird, gross, self-indulgent rich kids, which is often true, but with an exception that's going to matter later. But at the same time, particularly for their prominence within music, they would have an outsized cultural impact, touching really countless artists, ranging from the Beatles to the Doors, Pink Floyd, Jefferson Airplane. Really, anyone at that time had to jump in. But at the same time, there was also a much more serious, grittier political side to this new milieu. There would often be overlaps, particularly in protests, and there was an alignment on rejection of the status quo, but in large part, the true political activists usually felt that they were taking advantage of the naive rich kids. There would be a growth in radical Marxist organizations, some which would engage in the planting of explosives, causing real damage. In fact, for a little while, there was an actual bombing problem in the United States. There would be the growth of an anti-war movement, particularly in opposition to the heating up Vietnam War. And this movement is quite interesting, because while it did certainly have these Marxist elements, as well as the young, perhaps naive hippies, so many of its numbers were really not the young people nor anti-establishment, but older generations who were just tired of seeing their sons killed. By 1967, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale would formalize the Black Panther Party platform. They believed that civil rights legislation had been insufficient to address urban poverty and police brutality. They would draw inspiration from many of these Marxist or quasi-Marxist thinkers, particularly in Europe, such as Franz Fanon's anti-colonialism. They would also take inspiration from the Chinese, looking at Mao Zedong as inspiration, all while at their core they were driven by black nationalism. And so now ethnic movements were becoming increasingly aggressive, and that fun, light little burst of color was becoming increasingly dark. Political violence was increasing. The radicals of the New Left were becoming more assertive, and rising very much to the fore, where once it was young kids dancing and meditating. At that same time, that very fun countercultural movement that had existed, primarily of the children of the wealthier middle and upper classes, centralized in California, had begun to attract many more of the lower classes. The extreme openness and proliferation of drugs had become very attractive to drifters, and increasingly a more criminal element would begin to enter into these areas, particularly places like San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. This extreme openness and porousness to criminality is one of the most fundamental problems at the core of liberalism. Teenage drug-fueled orgies and Mellotron music is one thing, but by the time you're dealing with stabbings and shootings, it's a quite different matter. And they really didn't have a way to safeguard against this inevitability. And so many who had made up this movement, particularly as they were getting further into their 20s by this point, would either just enter into professional life, or many who held on to the original vision would go off to live in rather libertarian communes. And by 1969, and the very public trial of Charles Manson and his, quote, family, the runaways and street toughs who accompanied him, the public was really unhappy with all of this. And so the fun time was over. However, the truly charged political actors were not so easy to get rid of. Marxist terror organizations would continue, while black nationalist groups would become increasingly aggressive. The 1970s would come, and things just felt heavier, particularly after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. It was clear that philosophical disagreements were not going to be mediated via guitar, and that perhaps that post-war prosperity was just a temporary respite, and that the country was getting back to harsher realities. After enormous fiscal expenditure for President Lyndon Johnson's progressivist vision, the enormous cost of the war, the offshore dollar system and gold convertibility, forcing Richard Nixon to close the gold window, and ultimately oil shocks in the Middle East, the stagflation and economic malaise of the 1970s would show that the Keynesian model had failed. Many began to look at different economic models. Some would turn much more free market, believing in the failures of the large and imposing government, while others increasingly socialist, believing that the government hadn't done enough, and that this was proof of an inherently unfair capitalist society. Either way, in the 1970s, people stopped believing in the system, and people stopped believing in new liberalism. In 1971, John Rawls would publish A Theory of Justice. This work would be enormously influential ever since. In it, he would propose the idea of the veil of ignorance, the notion being that if one were to attempt to create a moral system, a social structure which could be said to be moral, then it would be best done if one assumes that he will be placed into it at random, not knowing who nor where in the society he will be. Thus, if one can create a system where he feels happy entering into it entirely at random without knowing where he will end up, then he has created a moral system. This gets at the idea that very often when people argue for the morality or immorality of a social system, it comes from the personal point of view, unable to be disentangled from one's own interests, when really, if it were to be done properly, in theory this would have to be done by entirely removing oneself from consideration, giving equal consideration to all of society. This work would create the framework for the social liberalism that was emerging, asserting that a just society must maximize opportunities for its least advantaged, while simultaneously preserving core personal liberties. 3 years later, in 1974, Robert Nozick would respond directly to Rawls, publishing Anarchy, State, and Utopia, presenting an argument for libertarianism. Here he would argue for a minimal night watchman state, arguing that wealth redistribution is morally equivalent to forced labor, as if one works and does not have agency over the fruits of one's labor, instead being required to give them to another, then this is no different than if the labor were done without agency for the benefit of another, which is enslavement. And this is the big rift that's developing. It had become clear that the mid-century state had failed, yet what people couldn't quite figure out was if it was because there was too much government or not enough government. Either way, it wasn't the right amount of government. For many, the presidency of Lyndon Johnson was the final nail in the coffin for progressivism. It was extremely expensive and got little results. The stagflation of the 1970s was more than just a loss of confidence in policy, however. That sense of liberal American progress that had really begun under Franklin Roosevelt had been evaporated. Many were beginning to leave the progressivist movement, while internally the New Left was as well fracturing. In 1973, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago would be published in English the following year. There was a real moment of doubt for the Western left, and though the process had already begun, particularly after the publication of Gulag Archipelago, the ability to defend Soviet communism was quickly dwindling. Prior to that point, many in academia, and particularly many in the media, had been downplaying the horrors in the Soviet Union, elevating its successes, and attempting to maintain a Marxist position that the Soviet vanguard state was a model for the future. Yet as so much had become known about the Soviet Union, this was becoming untenable, and so that rupture that had begun within more elite academic circles of Marxists decades ago was now quickly spilling over into the Western left at large. In 1975, French post-structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault would publish Discipline and Punish. He was proposing the post-structuralist approach to narrative, to dismantle the Enlightenment liberal narrative of steady and inevitable progress. He would as well argue that social institutions like asylums, prisons, and schools don't really exist to benefit those they are said to serve, but instead act as invisible systems of surveillance and control. Further elaborating on this point, he would formulate the concept of biopower, arguing that authoritarian structures, like the ability for a government to use law enforcement or military, was actually quite limited in the maintenance of control. He would argue instead that within liberal societies, regime control was maintained by invisible social relationships. This was on the order of the institutions, but as well interpersonally between the society's members. Think, for example, of an authoritarian society where there is a powerful dictator with a robust and brutal internal police force. It would appear on the surface that this regime had tremendous control over the society. Yet if the population began to oppose the regime, they could, in theory, begin to meet in secret, plotting to overthrow it. While they wouldn't have control over official institutions, they could privately spread contra-regime propaganda, arguing with each other against the regime. Ultimately, if enough of the population came to resent this regime, then it's entirely feasible that through sabotage, disobedience, or even insurrection, the disillusioned population could turn against the dictator and overthrow him. Yet in a liberal system, there is something much more pernicious and subtle, for it's not the top-down control of the regime that maintains its power. It's the distributed control system between all of its members, because in a liberal democracy, People believe that the government represents them, and believes that because they vote, the government is a reflection of what everyone wants. If one were to move too far against the regime, if one were to argue too fundamentally against the system or against liberalism, then that would be perceived by the society as being against them, like trying to argue against voting in a liberal democracy. The society would enforce the regime itself, as the population believe that opposition to the liberal democratic regime is opposition to the will of the people. One no longer simply needs to be worried about some government police force finding out about their dissidents, but would have to worry about ostracism from every member of its society. This was, however, in many ways an older form of post-structuralism at its tail end. At the same time, this philosophical milieu was beginning to form into something new, postmodern philosophy, a term taken from the artistic and literary movement. In 1979, Jean-Francois Lyotard would publish The Postmodern Condition, defining postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. This was taking many of these post-structural arguments, and many of those that had been proliferating within the realm of literary analysis, and extending them much wider in scope. The argument being presented here is that those deep fundamental narratives of society, ideas like liberal progress, the Marxist class struggle, or really anything that could be said to be a big societal story that more particular stories derive themselves from, were inherently flawed and should be rejected. What is even real? Why does it even matter? To a great extent, these questions really defined the intellectual environment of the 1970s. For many, this rejection of meta-narrative would be applied to, if not Marxist, quite near-Marxist philosophies, many beginning to make bolder assertions that our very notions of truth are fundamental beliefs. The core understanding of the world that we have really just existed to perpetuate this liberal capitalist machine. What if? What if it was all a lie? This is a really interesting strain of thought because so much has come from it, some extremely useful and some extremely disastrous. What is so powerful about it is that it gets a look at the machine underneath society. It points out that humans socially run on stories, and that ultimately they're just stories and not reality. This can be extremely useful to work with, and can yield fantastic insights. Yet many who began to engage in this sphere of thought would quite quickly come to what we think of as postmodernism today, which is functionally a rejection of objective truth. The argument goes that everything humans experience, and everything that humans can convey between each other, are ultimately just representations. Ultimately, they're stories. And since these are just stories, that means that they should be as distrusted as any narrative. The fundamental folly here is that so many began to reject the notion of truth itself. An argument that now exists within a great deal of metamodern thought is that there is objective truth, that there is an actual objective reality to existence. However, humans cannot interact directly with it. And so while if people cannot interact with truth directly, instead being forced to rely on stories, this is still a noble and good pursuit, as humans should attempt to hone the accuracy of their stories. Many within postmodern thought rejected this, making the leap to there being no objective truth at all, or at the least, that humans were never able to get even close to it, so why even bother to think about it? This can spiral very easily, as this puts one in the position of accepting that everything is relative. If taken to its ultimate conclusion, this means that no assertion nor conclusion is better than any other, that what one asserts as truth is equal to what anyone else asserts, and that there are no things which can be said to be moral nor immoral. This often gets conflated with nihilism, saying that nothing matters. Yet this form of postmodern thought was saying something even deeper. It was saying that nothing is. The art and culture of the 1970s would reflect this very inward-looking, rather melancholic sensibility. The fun, light, flowery music of the psychedelic rock and folk revival eras was on the one hand being replaced with grittier, sometimes more sophisticated music like progressive rock, where once there had been songs about teenage love, wanting to change the world and everyone getting along, or about freedom and exploration. Now there were these long, rather inward, reflective, quite complex compositions exploring rather existential ideas, like the futility of endeavor, insanity, or solipsism. Just to give an example of the same band, only 6 years apart, from 1967 to 1973, here are some Pink Floyd lyrics. I want to tell you a story about a little man, if I can, a gnome named Grimble Grumble, and little gnomes stay in their homes. Compared with gritty 1970s prog rock, and then one day you'll find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run, you missed the starting gun. At the same time, early forms of metal were beginning to emerge. There was something much harsher and more raw, with as well the emergence of punk, taking a much more cynical tone. All of these rejecting the naive optimism of the 1960s. On the other hand, there would be what could only be described as indulgent music. There were genres of funk and disco proliferating. Many of these spoke to young adult and middle-aged populations who were out clubbing, taking drugs, or being quite libertine. As things were looking increasingly bleak, many were just turning to hedonism as a replacement for optimism, and this rather repetitive, hollow, yet fun music lended itself very well to that Studio 54-esque indulgence. To think in rather archetypal terms, the cute young couple playing guitar in the field and taking LSD, "Aw, far out man, we're gonna love each other forever," had been replaced by an older couple of swingers taking cocaine and obsessing over money. "Don't worry about her, we're separated. Bitch is gonna get everything in the divorce. Might as well hit a bump, haha." The long-haired, optimistic poet driving across the country had been replaced by a dark and moody author. While this is quite evident on the artistic level, this was as well manifesting in the philosophical realm. And though so many new ideas were beginning to form, so many had their own takes, their own novel philosophies. To a large extent, the same thing was being asked. What's even the point? In 1979, the election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government would mark a turning point in Britain. Shortly thereafter, in the 1980 American election, Ronald Reagan would signal a similar shift. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Montpellier consensus had won. Monetarist and supply-side economics would become dominant in both governments, with the ideas of Chicago school thinkers like Milton Friedman signaling that neoliberalism was to be the dominant philosophy. In both countries, there would be waves of deregulation, privatization, and the breaking of labor union power. The economic recoveries of the 1980s were philosophically curious. There weren't really many new movements that emerged at this point, at least not notable ones, but the realignment that was underway would be extremely robust. It seemed that in the debate about progressivism, Keynesianism, and the role of the state, the fatigue at the failures of the heavy-handed progressivist government had simply become too much. The free marketeers were ascendant, and slowly, as both countries began to leave behind their days of economic malaise, a new optimism would rise. Consumer spending would expand, stock market participation would boom, and business activity would ramp up rapidly. There would be an ethos of trusting the private sector that would emerge, and as well amongst the young, there would be some quite remarkable shifts. Many of the youth of the 1970s had grown up with a certain jadedness. There was a strong cynicism, and a value on self-reliance. Yet perhaps symbolically, at the end of the 1970s, the release of Star Wars would represent a shift, particularly for the younger kids, who in the 1980s were growing to be teens or young adults. There was a rebirth in belief of self-reliance, a belief that great things were possible. where a bit over a decade ago, the young rebels had been free and libertine hippies, increasingly the young rebels were the responsible conservatives. Now, neither Ronald Reagan nor Margaret Thatcher were really conservative in a traditionalist sense, yet what they were was not progressive, asserting that the heavy-handed regulatory government had gone too far. While many often think of these eras as conservative, on the cultural level they were still extremely liberal, and even though the economics were not progressive, Montpelier and neoliberalism still certainly is a philosophy within the liberal lineage. Really, it was more of a reorientation, an acceptance that the progressive vision had truly failed, and maybe to an extent, it was people just getting tired of being so cynical. Ultimately, as the 1980s would near a close, the Soviet Union would fall, and to many, it would appear as though communism had been decisively defeated philosophically, as what was once its vanguard state had fallen, while the liberal Anglo-American order was charging ahead and getting rich. The 1990s would begin with the publication of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man. This book would effectively argue that the end state of human social development was this global liberalism, that really all there was left to do was to tinker around the edges, as there was no fundamental system that could yield any better result. Where else was there to go? This attitude would be ascendant throughout the 1990s, as there was no longer a Soviet Union to serve as an antipode to Anglo-American liberalism. It appeared as though liberalism had simply won, and as the Western economies were charging ahead, this reinforced to many that globalist neoliberalism was the path to prosperity. Yet, despite these good feelings, there was a lurking decay underneath the surface. Particularly following trade policies during the Clinton administration, the fruits of globalism were not living up to what had been promised. The fundamental argument behind globalism is British free trade comparative advantage. The argument goes as such, that instead of every country producing diversified goods, each country should focus on what it is able to produce most efficiently. Say, for example, there was a country that had produced everything that it needed, yet because of its natural resources, the skill set of its labor force, and its geographic position, it was uniquely positioned for auto manufacture. It should then get rid of its less efficient industries and focus almost entirely on auto manufacture. Practically, this very rarely meant just one single industry, but did mean a heavy compression and consolidation into far fewer industries than would be necessary for a country to sustain itself. However, the promise in return is that as everyone was able to produce so much more efficiently, they could sell their goods into the global market, in turn collecting a profit, and using that to buy goods from other countries who are producing what they produce most efficiently. Thereby, we all produce the most efficiently. We all get what we need because we can buy it, as the economy is global and goods are traded freely, and we will produce the most goods as efficiently as possible. We will all get rich together. At a glance, this is a quite convincing argument. Naturally, wouldn't we be in the best position if we did what we did best? Isn't that tautologically true? Yet it hides some deeper mechanisms. 1. The mobility of labor. At a glance, this argument seems to say that the labor force of all countries should produce what they produce best. Yet, in a global capital economy, where investors can move capital around the world with very little friction, what this really means is that investment will go to where labor is most efficient, meaning cheapest. All capital investors will scramble for the cheapest labor. Some countries become labor countries, those with the cheapest labor, and the labor of the countries that have less cheap labor will simply stop laboring. Further, it means that supply chains and the self-sufficiency needs of all countries will not only be less robust, but dangerously unstable. Imagine a serious war to break out. Imagine if there were a natural disaster in the one place that makes one vital input. Imagine a regime change, and suddenly a country that yours had been depending on simply closes down its trade. Every country is now extremely fragile, dependent on every other country for their own prosperity. And particularly if your country has a comparative advantage in the production of a commodity, well, this can be a bit of a problem in a global financial system where commodity futures dictate prices, as it's not really your market that sets your prices. It's some guys in office buildings a continent away. The promises sounded so good, yet increasingly more and more of the lower classes of the West would begin to find that there was no more investment into them. Layoffs would increase, hiring would slow down, and once bustling factory towns that had been the pride of families, whole communities, would begin to wither away, the factories rotting. Yet in the 1990s, the promise of those efficient, cheap goods still reigned. To many, it seemed as though as long as there were cheaper appliances in the store, who really cared about those people in the Rust Belt? All the same, some were beginning to notice, beyond just the ignored lower classes who were taking the brunt of it. In 1990, Alastair McIntyre, Michael Sandel, and Charles Taylor would launch a communitarian challenge to Rawls. This new school of thought would propose that liberalism's view of an individual as an unencumbered and autonomous being is simply wrong, and that humans are embedded in historical, communal, and moral traditions. The 1990s were still ultimately an era of good feelings. To so many, it was the end of history. At the same time, there was the Washington Consensus. As the Anglo-American liberal world order was dominant over the world, there was new attention being turned to the developing economies, a term which would become dominant within economic and financial thought. There would be a push for investment and aid, creating a framework that these poor economies must adopt fiscal discipline, open free trade, and marketization. It looked like endless potential to so many. It looked like Anglo-American liberalism was supreme. It looked as though the liberal world order would be unchallenged, and that globalism was inevitable. Yet at the same time, the emerging undercurrent viewed this as impersonal, materialistic, cold, and completely lacking in an understanding of human behavior and psychology. One major example is the pivot to China. During this era of globalization, so much Western capital was flooding into China. The economy would soar, and China would become the world's factory, producing an enormous quantity of cheap goods. Under liberal globalist philosophy, and under the Washington Consensus, the tabula rasa-based view was that as China became wealthier by engaging in trade with the West, it would in turn become more like the West, since tabula rasa asserts that ultimately we're blank slates, only made different by material and cultural constraints imposed on us. The logical conclusion is that as China became economically more like the West, and interacted with the West more, of course the blank slate Chinese would become like the Western liberal. Turns out, that was wrong, because perhaps people are not blank slates. Perhaps liberal globalism was naive and blind. What actually happened is that as China got wealthier, it reasonably assumed that this was owing to the Chinese model. They would see the success of Chinese endeavors and the Chinese way of doing things, and conclude that this was an indication of the success of the Chinese way. If anything, as China got wealthier, they became more Chinese. So indeed, there were cracks forming in the liberal globalist vision, and this communitarian challenge was beginning to rise. Though as a minority position at that point, the dominant views were global free trade, the supremacy of markets, the inevitability of liberalism, and the moral commandment of colorblindedness. The liberal vision was very much focused on the assumptions downstream of tabula rasa. Everyone's the same. Increasingly, acceptance of homosexuality would rise, with the liberal assertion of live and let live, because after all, they were just born that way. Which, geez, isn't great with tabula rasa, huh? Well, just better not think about it, because since we're all the same, that must mean it doesn't matter. Aid projects would increase. Why are there so many poor countries? Why aren't they developing like the liberal West? If we're all the same, only made different by material condition, well then it must be the material condition. Liberal globalism was becoming a crusade again, just as it was in the 19th century in the era of liberal imperialism. Large financial and economic institutions, like the World Bank and IMF, would increasingly entangle themselves in foreign economies and governments. Really, whether you wanted it or not, you were getting rolled into the liberal order. This made many very unhappy. Many did not like the onerous debt terms. They did not like the demands that they open up their economies to foreign capital, and thereby become owned by foreign banks. Many did not like that they were being ordered by foreign nations to denationalize their national industries, because the liberal thing to do is have it be owned by HSBC. Many were not thrilled with liberalism being forced into their countries. Yet all the while, as the liberal order increasingly imposed itself on everyone of the world, it felt good to the people of the West. They could still tell themselves the story that this was raising people up, that once they achieved a state of material prosperity, everyone would be the same. Really, by the 1990s, the West had just reinvented the Victorian Empire. It felt so good at home, but resentment was growing. After the economic booms of Reaganomics and Thatcherism, the Anglo-American left would enter with a counter-proposal. In the United States, Bill Clinton would be elected as president, introducing the country to the New Democrats, ones who had rejected many of the older progressivist notions of the Lyndon Johnson era, and had become increasingly neoliberal, attempting to find some meld between Reagan and later Bush's free markets, and the liberal progressivist vision of the helping hand state. Meanwhile in Britain, as the conservative era of Thatcher and later John Major would give way, perhaps an even more extreme example of this shift would enter with the prime ministership of Tony Blair. In common, both Clinton and Blair would accept neoliberal globalization and market efficiency, but would believe that the tax revenues generated by these financialized systems should fund social projects and services in the pursuit of equality. For Britain, this marked a time of cool Britannia, an era of good feelings. The musical genre of Britpop would be ascendant, with a quite positive self-image and a new confidence in the country. Yet all the while, Tony Blair would work on structural changes much deeper than the public were aware of. Tony Blair and New Labour would take fundamentally Fabian ideas and adapt them to something radically different. They would pay much more attention to the media, working very hard to build a close relationship with the Fleet Street apparatus. All the while, they would build up the bureaucracy, ensuring that even if their government were gone, their regime would continue in Whitehall. This would mark a clear ascendancy of Whitehall over Parliament, creating what has since become known as the Quangocracy, the rule of unelected bureaucrats and government-adjacent institutions. Both regimes were making a strong push for the middle class, with both the Democrats and Labour fundamentally abandoning their working class bases. And if one thinks of the mechanism of global financialization, this strategy makes a lot of sense, since both Britain and the United States were financializing, with Labour moving to where labor was cheapest, offshore in countries like China. Then what political capital was there to gain from an increasingly weakening and dwindling share of the population? This new neoliberal left concerned itself much more with the educated middle classes, media, and finance. At the same time, it really wasn't quite clear what the establishment nominal right wings should do. With the Soviet Union gone, the role of the Warhawk factions seemed to be pointless. More than just politicians, there were enormous swaths of the administrative structures that had nothing to do. There were people who had gone to university, gotten advanced degrees, and dedicated their entire professional lives to studying the Soviet Union. And so just what were they supposed to do when there was no Soviet Union? In part, this would engender a rift between paleoconservatives and neoconservatives. Paleoconservatives would look back to earlier liberal notions. Particularly in the United States, this would in large part mean turning to the ideas of the Founding Fathers and thinkers from the 19th century. They would believe that the country should turn itself inward and concern itself with the state of its own people, focusing less on foreign affairs. They would assert that the government had gotten too large and needed to be smaller and less onerous, as it had begun to infringe on the rights of the population and stifle productivity. In large part, this was a belief that the country should return to what it was before. They would draw a great deal of influence from Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke. To many, this was an extremely enticing vision. Many had become tired with dealing with the affairs of the world. Many were tired with the enormous state. Many believed that the country had lost its way. In the aftermath of the Cold War, this presented one possible vision, both for the United States and for Britain. Yet simultaneously, the neoconservative vision would rise. Now this one has a much more nuanced intellectual history. It can find its origins with the liberal imperialists, those who believe that the role of the liberal British Empire should be to elevate the peoples of the world, to share prosperity, to raise up the savages, and to save backward people from unscrupulous leaders and barbarism. Those who would form the backbone of the neoconservative movement would largely be leftists from the 1960s and 70s. Many who had been part of the left at this time would become disillusioned with progressivism, seeing the failures of Lyndon Johnson, or in the case of Britain, the mid-century Labour governments. At the same time, they would not be enticed by the new variants of Marxism that were being perpetuated by the New Left. And so, in searching for something to latch onto, they would come across old liberal imperialism, and thus they would come to believe that the role of the United States, or Britain, was to involve itself internationally, to bring liberalism to the world, and to enforce it, arguing that this may necessitate heavy military involvement. And so this goes back to that breakdown of the left-right spectrum within liberalism from the previous episode. In many ways, they're not that much different from the utopianism of the progressivists or the Marxists. They just happen to believe in foreign adventurism to get it done. So what exactly should one call that? It isn't progressivism, it isn't Marxism, it isn't the New Left, yet it is some form of hyper-liberalism, just an updated form of an older vision. Increasingly, it seemed that everyone in the philosophical domain was looking at lofty ideas. The much more immediate and pragmatic concerns just were no longer as relevant. Largely, the academic post-Marxist left had come to the conclusion that traditional Marxism had failed, and that as capitalism had been so productive, there was no point in trying to get the working class on their side. Instead, they would turn to what they considered struggle groups, proposing what they would consider a great radical democratic project, uniting all the oppressed of the world against the global oppressors. In 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw would introduce the notion of intersectionality. Of these oppressed struggle groups, she would propose that they could not be considered in isolation, and that everyone existed as an intersecting nexus of these categories. Thus, if, say, someone were oppressed because they were black, and someone were oppressed because they were a woman, and someone were oppressed because they were a homosexual, then they were oppressed to the power of 3 as a gay black woman. We all know where this one went. And so the Oppression Olympics had been invented. The following year, in 1990, Judith Butler would publish Gender Trouble. She would argue that there was nothing inherently real to gender, arguing that there was no real physiological difference between men and women, nor mental difference. That, yeah, at least ones that, on their own, should manifest in the social sphere at all. But instead that it was performative, that the differences that people were actually observing were really learned behaviors that were inculcated to people as they grew up in the society. There was something beginning to emerge in academia, something taking on the neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, the anti-colonialism of Franz Fanon, the various social projects of the New Left, and melding them all with rather postmodern approaches to epistemology. The crux of all of it, that the things that people believe are real are really only systematic self-reinforcing narratives for intersectional oppression. And we are back at the word count. If you liked the word counts before, oh boy, get ready for even more words. So there liberalism was. Economically, things were going pretty well, except for the forgotten lower classes that were forgotten. Financial markets were chugging ahead, and the world was increasingly globalizing. The global liberal vision sincerely believed that as this economic process played out, eventually all of the world would become like the Western liberal, and there would be no more need for there to be countries, borders, nor wars. The disputes that did exist had become increasingly abstract, as the real practical arguments just weren't there. In large part, this era was very naive and optimistic. If you think of the ideologue from this era, quite often it's something like a feminist or a homosexual, someone involved with a pet project. Protests were for things like a tree being cut down. Really, perhaps? At least to a great extent? People were just trying to find something to be upset about. The financial crisis of 2008 would serve as another philosophical wrecking ball, decisively shattering the end of history. The financial crisis would show the failures of the system that appeared inevitable. It showed that the financial system and the economy had not been engineered into a state of perpetual prosperity. It exposed for all to see unscrupulous actors, and just how much the reigning establishment didn't care about the lower classes. A large amount of the optimism that had been building over the prior decades had come from the perpetual credit bull market and the affordability of homes. Yet as credit portfolios would fail, the financial system would be locked down, and the United States would flood the world with a vast tsunami of liquidity, all while normal people found themselves foreclosed on and laid off. The remaining vestiges of the American dream turned to dust. People caught a glimpse of the apparatus that ran the liberal order. People caught a glimpse at the financial machine behind the empire, the apparatus upon which everything runs. They would see mountains of arcane credit derivatives, short-sighted and foolish, greedy behavior, and what appeared to them as a system of stacking the deck. Many narratives would form about the financial crisis, and largely, very few people actually understood it on any deep level. The more sophisticated people know about the failures of the value-at-risk models, the collapse of credit portfolios, and just how levered mortgage-backed securities had become. Yet even this is a very small sliver of what actually happened. In reality, the financial system had just grown to be too vast and arcane. People really didn't know what they were seeing. People didn't understand the machine. But what was evident to people is that it did not run in their benefit, and that the institutions that they had placed their trust in really just existed to pick their pockets. And so the end of history was over. Trust was rapidly evaporating, and after years of building up trust and optimism, once again, cynicism reigned. As the liberal philosophical order was once again on shaky ground, many would emerge with new ideas, new movements would form, new authors would write outside of the frame, and people would open themselves up to ideas that they never would have before. There would be a set of growing populist movements, particularly those angry with the handling of the financial crisis. Some, from a more progressivist angle, viewed the response as a bailout for bankers, who escaped unscathed, unpunished for their wrongdoing that wrought so much suffering on everyone else. They wanted a heavier government, something to set the unfairness right. while others looked at the government and saw just how onerous and Byzantine it had become. Particularly during the global war on terror era, new national security legislation, particularly the Patriot Act, would look to many like the construction of a police state, and so a rather libertarian strain would once again emerge, frightened by what they saw as impending tyranny. Meanwhile, what had been building in academia would surge ahead with far more momentum. Over the course of the 2010s, building on Crenshaw's '89 intersectionality notion, there would be a renewed progressive fervor, with newly energized post-Marxists taking over academia and media, their quest as they saw it to dismantle systemic overlapping hierarchies. New academic departments would proliferate rapidly, with fields like queer theory, gender theory, women's studies, fat studies, critical whiteness studies, or disabilities studies, rapidly sweeping Western academia and minting advanced degrees, in turn creating a professional class who were the students of this movement. They had adopted the postmodern skepticism and cynicism of truth. They viewed claims of meritocracy, objectivity, and colorblindness as linguistic defense mechanisms for oppressor groups to maintain control. Across all of these different departments and sub-disciplines, including very major ones, such as English departments, sociology, or psychology, it was largely the same philosophy and same vision. Dismantle that which people believed in, elevate the marginal, and denigrate the core. The fundamental thesis behind queer theory is a perfect encapsulation of this thought. Going back to some very old Marxist ideas, they believed that the revolution must be eternal, that there should always be an endeavor to elevate that which is marginal, pushing forward a social linguistic revolution in perpetuity. Say you exist in a society that looks askance at homosexuality. Within the queer theory framework, the goal should be to elevate homosexuality and to denigrate heterosexuality, thereby pushing forward the progressive social revolution. Yet once homosexuality had become part of the new core, it was no longer useful. The queer theorist should then look to who remains on the margins, perhaps group sexuality, perhaps transgenderism, elevate those while pushing aside homosexuality. Once this has been completed, elevate further fringes, perhaps zoophiles, or reviled fetishists like coprophiles, elevate them, push down the core, and continue this infinitely. Thus the revolution will be eternal, the only way to get to utopia. Within this framework, queer does not mean homosexual. It means whatever the fringe is, whatever is not part of the social core. And thus, when people in this milieu use the term, it doesn't mean any particular thing. It just means not what everyone else is. Like saying sexual outsider or fringe. At the same time, the other main avenues for this movement would come from novel feminist movements and movements focusing on ethnic minorities. The common thread to all of them: elevate that which society rejects, destroy all the customs, traditions, ways, and especially narratives of society, pushing down the core makeup of society, elevating that which it rejects. Something that people would notice is that before a topic had even been introduced to this sphere, it was quite easy to predict what their position on it would be. And while perhaps a crude encapsulation, maybe the best way of summarizing it is if it sucks, it's good. And if it's beautiful, righteous, and pure, it's bad. This movement would rely heavily on dialectical inversion and the utility of language, often using words in different ways than the population did, using linguistic manipulation to trap people in novel frameworks, or to be unable to interact with their own. For example, the insistence on neopronouns, referring to people by things as they, them, sie, zir, zim, fey, fear. For if one acquiesces and uses such terms, even if that person simply believes that they are being polite, they have tacitly and inherently accepted the linguistic framework of this philosophy. Once you use words that inherently demonstrate that you believe certain things, then regardless of what you actually think, functionally you believe those things. For example, if one does not believe that non-binary is a true meaningful sexual category, yet acquiesces and uses the pronouns of they and them, then it doesn't really matter what that person thinks. They have inherently assented to the position of non-binary gender, in turn perpetuating the philosophical framework and inherently operating within it, the outcome no different than if you did believe in it. And over time, as more people do this, they come to truly believe it, as their entire social-linguistic sphere all functionally has assented to it. For as wacky as these people might seem, they do actually understand the mechanism of language on a quite sophisticated level, at least the higher-order academics. So often the things that people hold as fundamental beliefs are things that they haven't really intellectually thought up arguments for. Why is it good to have children? Why is marriage good? Why is it good not to have crime? So many things are just taken as given, and so a large part of this movement was to use language to subvert those things which people had not come up with stated arguments for, making use of opposites to subvert the fundamentals of society. To many ideologues, particularly in academia, media, and activist groups and NGOs, this was it. This was the moral crusade. This was the cause of all causes. Think back centuries to earlier in the series when we looked at the French Revolution, when we looked at how Christianity viewed the victim. This was the fundamental cause for this movement. Everything which had been pushed to the side, everything which was rejected, everything which people did not like, although they approached it from a rather atheistic direction, at its core, this was that the society opposed was the victim. The victim is virtuous, the society, the villain. Once you accept that core, that whatever society has rejected must be the virtuous victim, must be for them their Jesus, there you quite easily arrive at the conclusion that if it sucks, it's good. Yet for most, this wasn't really a moral crusade, as this grew so heavily in elite universities, particularly the Ivy Leagues and the quaint rich kid private schools. Holding such positions allowed one to identify with the elite classes. If you were able to make some long-winded argument about the systemic narratives of micro-oppression and blah, blah, that marked you as part of the upper classes. And so for most, they weren't true believers, but spouting such ideas allowed you to fit in with the upper classes. These became the fashionable opinions of the elite, and so in turn, increasingly the middle and lower classes would adopt them, attempting to appear higher status than they were. All the while, this would become quite dominant in media and corporate America. As increasingly more true believer students graduated with these ideas, they would become quite activistic in corporate America, pushing forward the Great Project. Initially, many in corporate America who had been feeling the heat of the fallout of the 2008 crisis would see this as an opportunity to deflect resentment, seeing it as perhaps useful. Yet increasingly, as these ideologues became more and more entrenched within American and Western European business, more of the actual corporate bureaucracy became true believers as well, and those who didn't really believe it often found themselves trapped, particularly by overbearing HR departments who used coercive tactics for ideological enforcement. Much of this, however, wasn't coming top-down from the institutions. In large part, these philosophical shifts were emerging from social media, in the case of this new hyper-liberal leftism, particularly Tumblr, and so it was self-perpetuating, for as hopelessness was returning, and so many people were quite angry with the institutions, people needed an outlet to direct righteous fury, and to believe in some greater cause. Of course, this was no real threat to the institutions, as the institutions were a major driving force, yet for many, it just gave them something to be angry about. And while this may sound quite foolish, having that pressure release valve, having something that feels like a crusade, is a very needed catharsis for many. Yet all the while, social media was rapidly opening the floodgates for all sorts of new information and views. Government and corporate malfeasance would become much more visible, as people were now able to share information in ways they never could before. So many new movements, ways of thinking, and sources of information would emerge in the 2010s. People who had long been interested in some niche area now found that they could communicate with entire groups across the world who shared their common interest. And so too, new intellectual movements would grow rapidly, as now people who thought that they were alone in their ideas could intellectually fortify their notions, building up their arguments, gathering more information, and as well, in turn, reverberate their ideas in online echo chambers. In 2016, the true power of social media would become evident to the establishment in a way that many had been actively ignoring up to that point. And that year, on both sides of the Atlantic, populist movements that had been building for the past decade would stun the liberal establishment with striking victories. In the United States, Donald Trump would win the presidency, demonstrating a victory of working-class populists, sovereigntists, and those skeptical of the elite institutions over both the establishment Republican Party and the neoliberal globalist Obama update to the New Democrats, shocking the elite consensus, who were convinced not only that Hillary Clinton would win the presidency, but that in some metaphysical sense, it was her turn. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, again the consensus polling would be proven wrong. The elite global liberal narratives of international institutions and globalization would be shown to have lost the confidence of the people, and Britons would vote to leave the European Union.